Good morning and welcome to this Middle East event, marking a somber and historic moment, as tomorrow we prepare to mark the 20-year anniversary of the terrorist attacks that struck the United States on September 11th, 2001. My name is Charles Lister, and I'm a senior fellow here at MEI, where I direct our Syria and counterterrorism programs. As I say, our event today comes at a particularly somber time, as we all prepare to mark tomorrow's anniversary. In many ways, it's hard to grasp that it was 20 years ago when al-Qaeda operatives so dramatically hijacked civilian aircraft over American skies and used them as weapons on American soil. On that day, more than 3,000 lives were lost. The world changed on September 11th, 2001, and many, if not most of us, changed too. In the 20 years since, counterterrorism campaigns have sought to neutralize and contain terrorist threats in every corner of the globe. Our response to 9/11 catalyzed a complete transformation of foreign and defense policy, both for good and for bad. Over time, our counterterrorism strategy and tactics have evolved, adapting to different threats, environments, and conditions. At home, substantial improvements in homeland security mean that the United States is now arguably safer from a 9/11 style attack than at any time since 2001. But sadly, though, the same cannot be said for the situation abroad. From Africa through the Middle East and into South and Southeast Asia, the threat posed by jihadist terrorism and its ideology has arguably never been more diverse, more globally distributed, more sophisticated, more financially self-sustaining, or more actively present in as many theaters. As of today, the world faces not one, but two global jihadi movements, and a proliferating array of other groups, ideologies, and challenges. 2 decades on from 9/11, a sense of fatigue is clearly settling into all sides of the political debate when it comes to counterterrorism. But to me, at least, a cursory examination of the global terrorism landscape doesn't lend itself well to a move towards disengagement. Recent developments in Afghanistan seem to augur particularly badly as far as the consequences of such moves are concerned, at least when they're conducted with little thought given to the day after. To discuss all of this and much more, I'm honored to introduce and to be joined by 3 esteemed speakers. First up, we have Dr. Tricia Bacon, who's currently an associate professor at American University's School of Public Affairs, where she directs the Policy Anti-Terrorism Hub. Prior to joining AU, Tricia worked on counterterrorism for more than 10 years at the State Department, including in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, the Bureau of Counterterrorism, and the Bureau of Diplomatic Security. Tricia is also a non-resident fellow at George Washington University's Program on Extremism, a member of the Advisory Council for MEI's Countering Terrorism and Extremism program, and the author of Why Terrorist Organizations Form International Alliances, which was published in 2018. Next, we have Edmund Fitton-Brown, who is currently the coordinator of the United Nations Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team concerning the Islamic State, al-Qaeda, and the Taliban. Like Tricia, Edmund is also a member of the Advisory Council for MEI's Countering Terrorism and Extremism program. Prior to joining the United Nations, Edmund was the British ambassador to Yemen, the UK's regional counselor for the Arabian Peninsula, and he joined the UK Foreign Office in 1984 and has also served in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Kuwait, Italy, and Finland. And last, but certainly not least, we have Lieutenant General Michael Nagata, who is Distinguished Senior Fellow at MEI and Senior Vice President and Strategic Advisor at CACI International. Mike retired from the US Army in 2019 after 38 years of active duty, with 34 of those years spent in US Special Operations. His final position was as Director of Strategy at the National Counterterrorism Center from 2016 to 2019. And before that, Mike was Commander of the US Special Operations Command from 2013 to 2015. Welcome to all 3 of you. In terms of format, we'll be beginning today with each panelist offering a relatively brief, roughly 5 minutes each of opening remarks, reflecting on 9/11, the past 20 years of counterterrorism policy, and what the future may hold in terms of threats and our responses. I'll then moderate a discussion between the panel before opening up for at least 30 minutes of questions from the audience. And to all of those of you tuning in today on Zoom, please feel free to pose your questions at any time throughout today's event using Zoom's chat function. And for those of you live streaming via MEI's website or on YouTube, you can email your questions to events@mei.edu. I'll be keeping across all questions as they come in, and I'll be doing my best to work as many of them as possible into the discussion. So without further ado, let me first pass on to Tricia for some opening thoughts.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you to MEI for having this panel today, for having me and with this fantastic group of people to talk at what is a very difficult anniversary. Reflecting on terrorism and counterterrorism proved much more challenging and sobering for this anniversary than ones in the past, and hopefully ones in the future. As Charles said, rather than being the end of this post 9/11 era, as it seems that many policymakers and analysts would seek and predict, my view is that we're entering a new phase of the movement. Since the inception in the mid-1960s, we've had these seminal events throughout the movement's history. And those have been the range from the Soviet withdrawal in 1989 to the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the Syrian civil war, and now the Taliban victory in Afghanistan. There's been this longstanding debate about what bin Laden intended to do with 9/11. And I'm not sure we'll ever have a decisive answer to that. But one of the theories is that he intended to draw the United States into a bleeding war in Afghanistan, that it would ultimately retreat from weakened, just as the Soviets had in 1989. And there is certainly a segment of the jihadist movement right now that very much sees his prophecy as having been completed, and will have this adrenaline that has been ejected into the movement with the Taliban victory in Afghanistan. They will see victories that were once seen as impossible as very possible now. With just a few minutes to make remarks, I wanted to delineate a couple areas to talk about. One is some of the areas that I think the US did well. One is where I think the US made some missteps. And then finally, where al-Qaeda simply did well. I have 4 for each, which is surely only the tip of the iceberg, but will hopefully get our conversation started. What actions hurt al-Qaeda the most? What was most effective against al-Qaeda? Above all, I would say the drone campaign in Pakistan during the Obama administration was the most damaging to al-Qaeda. It really eliminated key figures at a key time and created a deep sense of insecurity within the organization. Second, the initial US invasion in Afghanistan resulted in key losses for al-Qaeda as well, and really temporarily isolated al-Qaeda from other parts of the movement who were angry about its actions and the loss of the safe haven in Afghanistan. Third was the killing of bin Laden. The loss of a founding leader is always a seminal moment for an organization, especially when you have a long-standing founding leader. So in the case of bin Laden, he had created quite a foundation over decades with al-Qaeda. But even more than that, the US ability to find him and eliminate him forced al-Qaeda to go deeper underground and really affected Zawahiri's ability to manage and be a public leader once he took the reins. And fourth, as Charles mentioned, the US did bolster its domestic defenses in ways that made it harder to attack the homeland. I think that at times this can be a bit overemphasized. If we think historically, there were not many foreign terrorist attacks on the United States before 9/11 either, but there certainly was a bolstering of those kinds of defenses that had made it much harder to do so. In what ways did the US misstep? Above all, and I'll be surprised if there is disagreement about this, I would say the US invasion of Iraq was one of the key missteps from a counterterrorism and weakening al-Qaeda standpoint. And it wasn't really simply just the one-off invasion of Iraq. There were other interventions that the US supported that were counterproductive equally, such as the Ethiopian intervention in Somalia in 2006. Second was relying on predatory warlords and corrupt regimes as our primary CT partners. While they were sometimes effective at specific kinetic actions or in undertaking certain operations, their behavior too often exacerbated and caused grievances that made parts of the population more sympathetic to militant groups. This is very clearly one of the dynamics that happened in Afghanistan, and it was ultimately counterterrorism at the expense of counterinsurgency. Third, and potentially controversially, I think the US made a misstep when it alienated Iran, is calling it part of the axis of evil in 2002. I don't doubt that there would have eventually been a break between the US and Iran, and that there were such fundamentally important differences between the two countries that that break was coming at some point. Becoming what it did meant that we lost a window of opportunity to eliminate some key senior al-Qaeda leaders. We created conditions that allowed for the strange relationship that has emerged between the Taliban and Iran. And we forced the United States to be reliant on Pakistan, which is a government that engages in fundamentally some of the same exact behaviors as Iran in terms of supporting militant organizations. And finally, I would say, in terms of our missteps, it has been declaring and believing that we had achieved victories prematurely, whether that was the Taliban in 2001, the Islamic State in Iraq in 2009, and I also think al-Qaeda now. There's an overestimation of what military defeat can achieve and a failure to recognize these groups' ability to evolve. But what did al-Qaeda do well? What are its strengths? I would like to conclude by pointing to 4 of those. And one, which I think is often overlooked, is that al-Qaeda played an important role in helping and motivating the Taliban to launch an insurgency in Afghanistan. It is very hard to remember now that it took several years for the insurgency in Afghanistan to actually gain traction and emerge. Al-Qaeda was ready to fight from the outset, while there was divisions in the Taliban about whether to do so. And it helped to motivate the Taliban. It was certainly not the only cause or even the primary cause, but it helped to motivate the Taliban to engage in its insurgency. It provided tactical and operational advice and provided resources to the Taliban. Second, and probably reflective of my book that Charles mentioned earlier, I think al-Qaeda is very effective at selecting allies and maintaining those partnerships. We are aware of the obvious exception to that, but its ability to maintain its alliance with the Taliban, despite all of the tensions and the difficult dynamics that have been as part of that relationship, is really a testament to its alliance prowess. In addition, it is sometimes overlooked that al-Qaeda was able to keep all of its fundamental affiliate allies during the Islamic State challenge, a time when the Islamic State was clearly a desirable partner, basically on all major categories. Al-Qaeda's affiliates stayed with it. And so it's been able to maintain these relationships. Even its relationship with al-Qaeda in Iraq lasted longer than it should have by most rational calculations. So al-Qaeda has been very effective at creating and maintaining its relationships. The third thing I think al-Qaeda has done well was adapt to its circumstances in South Asia. As it lost a number of its operatives who came from outside of the region, from North Africa and the Arab world, it was able to cultivate the Pakistani militant landscape and integrate some of those operatives, who were quite experienced already, into its networks and be able to fill the gaps in its bench that came from the drone campaign through tapping into the Pakistani militant landscape, which ultimately resulted in the creation of another affiliate, the al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. And finally, I would conclude by pointing out how well al-Qaeda has adapted over the years. A lot of our discussion is about how al-Qaeda isn't the organization that it was in 2001. And I'm not sure that's the way to evaluate the success or the failure of the organization. It evolved significantly from trying to be a base who sent fighters to different conflicts in the early years to becoming a funding, training, advising, and assisting entity in the 1990s, into becoming this global jihadist entity that could conduct attacks in various parts of the world, including the United States, to this franchise with these very effective allies in key regions. I think we're going to see al-Qaeda evolve again in ways that will be threatening in its own right. And rather than comparing it to what it was in 2001, we need to be activating the analytic imagination and thinking forward into how al-Qaeda will evolve, and recognizing how impressive it is indeed that the group has survived 20 years of counterterrorism pressure since 9/11, and appreciate that it is a formidable adversary in those ways. With that, I'll hand it back over to you, Charles.
Tricia, thank you so much. There's definitely a lot to digest there. And while I do so, let me pass over to Edmund.
Thanks, Charles. Good morning, everybody. And I'm very happy and delighted to be included in this moment of reflection, commemorative event. Like everyone else, I remember exactly where I was when the planes struck the Twin Towers. I was walking the corridors of my office in London and became aware of a group of colleagues gathered around one of the, in those days, rare TV sets. And I went in and watched with them, trying to understand what terrible accident had occurred. And then the second plane hit, of course. And we looked at each other and we all knew that the world had just changed in front of our eyes. The UN in common with many others, entered this year, 2021, reeling from the pandemic, but clear that this forthcoming 20th anniversary of 9/11 must be marked both for retrospective and forward-looking purposes. What happened? What went well? What went badly? And we've just had some excellent reflections on exactly those points. What lessons did we learn? Where are we headed in terms of counterterrorism and other public policy priorities, either related ones or entirely distinct ones? The so-called war on terror has evolved through several phases. Most dramatic of them, perhaps, was the rise of ISIL, the establishment of their so-called caliphate, and the subsequent international reaction that led to its destruction. Now, 20 years on, we've come full circle, with attention turned back to Afghanistan and a new Taliban ascendancy there. I'm sure during today's webinar, we will discuss the detailed counterterrorism implications of this turn of events. I won't get into these up front, but be more than happy to attempt to answer any questions on them as we go on. Although this anniversary of 9/11 was never exactly a joyful event, I think it was anticipated by many in our community with excitement and a sense of importance and occasion. And then this summer, developments in Afghanistan sucked any positivity out of it, I think, and made it really, really somber. When you add that to the developments elsewhere, the other concerns that we have about counterterrorism around the world. Rising concerns over the emergence of new terrorist front lines in Africa persist, but they have been somewhat put in perspective by the events of August 2021. So let's take a breath. The media will jump back and forth between one theatre and another, forgetting whatever is not the headline of the day. They'll also forget terrorism when forest fires, hurricanes, or scandals become the shiny object. But as counter-terrorists and as participants in public policy formation, we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. There are always multiple simultaneous policy challenges to be met. Let's internalize the lessons of the last 20, indeed 30 years, and avoid lurching between over and under reaction. The international directed threat from ISIL and al-Qaeda is lower than it has been for years, and I think Charles made that point in his introductory remarks. But their intent and the underlying factors that gave rise to them persist. In this respect, at least, we can set aside our revulsion at recent events in Afghanistan and acknowledge and build upon the counterterrorism successes of the past 20 years, because we know we're going to need to be able to react to this challenge, which has not gone away and will certainly resurface in various forms. International cooperation and counterterrorism know-how, both of which are promoted by the United Nations, are equal to the challenge if we continue to nurture them. Human rights compliant counterterrorism is ethically sound and legally sustainable. We can and must continue to safeguard a world that is better than the dystopia promoted by the terrorists. As with all of the complex challenges of the modern world, terrorism demands a response commensurate with the threat and integrated into the framework of challenges and policy responses of member states and the international community. Hard counterterrorism, in the absence of mitigation of underlying causes, is unlikely to be sufficient. Coercive action that is not grounded in the rule of law is likely to be counterproductive. Monopolizing policy bandwidth may lead to the neglect of other issues of equal or even greater strategic importance. Equally, an overreaction away from counterterrorism, and that is a risk, especially, for example, after something as compelling as COVID-19. That runs the risk of easing pressure on terrorists and allowing their threat to revive. Maybe in that respect, events in Afghanistan last month have been in a way helpful, because they may have acted against some of the complacency that I heard setting in earlier this year about this strain of terrorism perhaps having been defeated. Let's keep all of these big issues in perspective and continue to get smarter and more effective in handling them. Thank you.
Edmund, thank you so much. That was a particularly good point you made there at the end about the complacency being replaced by renewed attention on Afghanistan. So thank you very much for your comments, and then we'll move on now to Mike.
Good morning to all of you. Charles, MEI, thank you for inviting me here, and it's a pleasure to see both Tricia and Edmund and be on the stage with them once again. I guess anyone who's a veteran of South Asia can't resist on a day like this thinking about where was I and what was happening around me on that fateful day. I'll tell you where I was. A much younger version of me with darker hair and a lighter heart. A Lieutenant Colonel Mike Nagata was in the middle of an operational briefing to my boss in a special operations organization I once commanded. I have no memory today of what in the world was I talking to my boss about, but I will never forget that moment when one of my soldiers burst into the conference room and said, "Hey, you need to turn on the television." And the rest is history. Minor footnote of that history, within 24 hours, I was emptying out my command, launching people towards Afghanistan. Little did I know how many years of my life I would then spend in South Asia. Over the years, as I look back, I can think of so many moments of great satisfaction and so many moments of equally sad disappointment. But I don't think I ever imagined that it would end the way it has. So what happens now? Probably the single most common question and topic I see being bandied about on television, in podcasts, on social media. What happens now? I have no magical crystal ball to divine what the answer to that question is, but I'll tell you what I think now happens. First of all, I think a rule that I consider to be kind of an iron rule of human nature is that usually the best indicator of future performance is past performance. So on the question of what do the Taliban now do, what does al-Qaeda now do, what does the Islamic State now do in this part of the world, in South Asia, I believe they will do what they have always done. They will seek to grow, they will seek to expand, they will seek to aggregate more power and influence. Certainly in terms of the Taliban, it means solidifying their gains within Afghanistan and figuring out what their most effective options are for any kind of international engagement. And then, of course, for ISIS and al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, I think it is utterly predictable. I think we're already seeing the early signs of their own attempts to recreate, expand, and strengthen their safe havens, to return to their original aspirations to export their version of jihad as far around the world as they possibly can. Does that mean a return to transnational terrorism? Absolutely. Does that eventually result in a direct threat against our homeland the way it did on 9/11? I don't know, but I have absolutely no doubt they will try. One thing is for sure, given the enormous opportunity that these terrorist groups now have to trumpet in every venue they possibly can, and they are certainly doing it, the defeat and the humiliation of the United States and the Western world, they will certainly try to exploit a tactic that has enormous strategic value for them, first demonstrated, I think, seriously by the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and that is to inspire attacks around the world. Many of us that dealt with ISIS in the early years remember the very simple, very successful formula they were advertising. Stay where you are, use what you have, and kill who you can. I personally expect we will see a return to that tool, that instrument, that while is very unlikely to present us with a mass casualty event like we had on 9/11, even a small attack with a rental car, with a butcher knife, with some sort of homemade explosive can have dramatic political effects around the world, given the way we are all stitched together electronically these days. Finally, I think it also, or at least I hope it puts to bed, a popular notion that many of us who live or have worked in Washington, D.C. for the last several years, over several administrations, have heard become very fashionable. The idea that because we're sick and tired of doing counterterrorism and we have more important work to do elsewhere when it comes to whether you call it great power competition or near peer adversaries or whatever the popular phraseology of today may be, no, we're not. I mean, we certainly have to grapple with these larger, potentially more dangerous strategic challenges around the world. But if we think we're going to be able to turn our back on terrorism, we're going to regret it, because terrorists will not be ignored. And it does not matter that they do not have the power or reach to create existential threats against the United States. The fact that they can just kill a few people very publicly and cause a complete shift in the political winds here in Washington, D.C. demonstrates the reality that we turn our back on terrorism at our peril. Lastly, I and thousands, perhaps millions of people around the world are now going to do their own, in the military parlance, it's called after-action review, but it's just basically the post-mortem. What happened? What did we get right? What did we get wrong? Both Tricia and Edmund have talked about this in their remarks. So here's my view. Here are some questions that I think the United States in particular should take very seriously in coming years as we study what happened here. What did we get right? What did we get wrong? First question is, did relatively short-term deployments to Afghanistan serve us well? And by short-term deployments, I'm talking about anything less than a year. Did that serve us well? My view is it did not. Number two, did the US ever develop, did the coalition ever develop the kinds of civilian capacities and capabilities that could actually match our rhetoric? And our rhetoric for 20 years was military activities only buy time and space for non-military activities and non-military actors to heal and resolve the issues that lead to insurgency and terrorism. Did we ever develop those civilian capacities and capabilities? I believe we never did. And finally, not just for Afghanistan, but really for the broader world, are we willing to acknowledge the simple, awful fact that despite all of the world's efforts, particularly after the events of 9/11, to contest violent extremism in all of its forms globally, not just the al-Qaeda and ISIS varieties, did it actually lead to a reduction in the amount of terrorism the world has to now confront? The answer is no. In my final position as the director of strategy at NCTC, I reported privately and I spoke publicly often about how I had come to the conclusion, however distasteful, that despite the world's best efforts for the last 2 decades, there are more violent extremists and terrorists around the world of all varieties than there were when we began. I do not think we can credibly claim that is what we were going for. Before concluding, I just want to say a personal word to everyone on this call who has skin in the game in South Asia, whether military or civilian, whether you deployed or didn't, just the fact that you worked on it in some way, shape, or form. Please take care of yourself. All of us are going through the grieving process today. Don't keep it to yourself. Find someone to talk to. Find someone to share it with. You are not alone. Thank you.
Mike, thank you so much for those comments and for that closing remark. I too would like to echo everything you've just said, but I certainly can't match your authority. But thank you. Tricia, let me come to you first. I mean, there's absolutely tons to discuss. All three of you have raised a whole host of very, very good points. But Tricia, particularly given things you've written recently, I wanted to ask you about Africa clearly taking out of the account recent developments in Afghanistan before everything went downhill there in the last few months. The big kind of trend, the big conclusion that everyone in the counterterrorism community was talking about was Africa's the new base, Africa's the new challenge. Jihadists from AQ to ISIS and more are finding more and more attractive theaters of operation in Africa. So maybe if I could just ask you, even though it's somewhat out of the Middle East Institute's sort of frame of reference, to what extent do you think that is or is still true? Can it change? And perhaps to bring in a point that I think most of you all referred to, but I think you highlighted particularly was, one of the lessons learned you mentioned was our over-reliance on sort of corrupt governments, warlords who are self-interested and predatory. I think most of the international community have learned similar lessons of those, but perhaps in different contexts about working in Africa. It's a big challenge, of course. So not just necessarily asking you about the current threat, but also how do we deal with that in Africa, considering the lessons you have said we have all learned about operating elsewhere?
I did not talk as much about Africa because of that. I mean, so I'm glad to bring that in. And I think Edmund's point that that what's happened in Afghanistan has temporarily, perhaps, or maybe for the broader term, overshadowed what Mike also referred to too, which is if you look at the picture in Africa comparing 2001 to 20 years later in terms of the jihadist movement, the findings are a stark failure in every measure you can consider. It has deepened in most of the places where it already existed. It has spread to new places, the number of attacks, the number of fatalities, the number of organizations, every measure you can think of. And that is, of course, not just a function of counterterrorism. There's a lot of factors that go on there, but it absolutely calls for a reevaluation of the counterterrorism approach in Africa. It is often the third or fourth priority when we're talking about counterterrorism. And it seems, as far as I can tell, that really dramatically has to change. This is one of those places where we want to shift to near peer or great power, or whatever we're supposed to be calling it. But when we're looking at the situation in the West and Sahel and East going into the South, there's almost half of the continent is affected by the jihadist movement at this point. So I think that is a serious indictment of the counterterrorism approach taken in Africa, which was different than it was in other places. And I think it really gets at some of those issues that have been raised about legitimacy of government, the corruption concerns, the predation concerns. When we started this conversation about post 9/11 about Africa, we talked a lot about ungoverned spaces and undergoverned spaces, and whether there would be safe haven for fleeing transnational extremists. And that wasn't necessarily the issue. It ended up coming from within Africa, and sometimes expanding the reach of predatory governments into places where they had a light touch actually was counterproductive. They had to improve their governments and their legitimacy before expanding them into those places. And that was not the sequence in which it happened. So I think Africa is going to continue we're going to continue to see a heightening of the threat there, and that this is another one of the ways that we can't turn away, even though the United States seems to be ready to do so.
Got it. Thank you so much. And Edmund, I have a follow-up question to you as well. The UN, your team has done an enormous amount of excellent reporting on Afghanistan, on the Taliban, on its links with al-Qaeda, on the Haqqani network, and on ISIS-K. I just wonder if maybe you could sort of give our audience a bit of a lay of the land in terms of your most recent public reporting on those dynamics, and perhaps also your personal analysis on what recent events in Afghanistan may or may not change in that regard.
Sure, yeah, we'll do. I mean, first of all, on al-Qaeda, of course, Afghanistan has always been very important to al-Qaeda. And we talked in our most recent report about the fact that Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of al-Qaeda, is a fading force. That was our sort of broad conclusion. I mean, there have been, of course, rumors of his actual death. We've never been able to confirm that. We've talked to a whole range of member states about that, and nobody is saying he's dead. But everyone agrees that he's he's either not well or in some other way indisposed and not really providing very much dynamic leadership. And I think another conclusion from that is that he's not going to be leading al-Qaeda for very much longer. That then raises a very interesting question, raised it in when we were writing the report in June, but of course it becomes even more topical now, which is what happens if Zawahiri dies or if his death is acknowledged. And we then have to look at a new leader of al-Qaeda. The question, the presumed successor to Ayman al-Zawahiri is another Egyptian called Saif al-Adil, known as Saif al-Adil, who is currently reported to be located in Iran. The question then arises, very interesting question, is what does a new leader of al-Qaeda do in those circumstances? Probably they don't want to remain located somewhere where they're under the control of what might be considered to be a hostile government. And then if he relocates, first of all, can he relocate? And if he can and he does, where does he relocate to? And we tentatively concluded in June that probably it was not in the strategic interests of the Taliban to be seen to allow something like that to happen in Afghanistan. Of course, that calculation may have shifted now. It's hard to know exactly where that calculation will have shifted to by the time that the event happens, but it's an interesting question. And we've already seen some pretty brazen al-Qaeda activity in Afghanistan since the Taliban's successes. Open question there. We did speculate, given his background, the fact he's Egyptian, the fact that he has a history of operating and living in Africa, would Saif perhaps relocate to some African theatre? And that's, I think, remains an open question, but yeah, very interesting question. In terms of al-Qaeda and Afghanistan, we know they're present in significant numbers. They have, in addition to sort of senior leadership figures, they also have al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, an affiliate which had been fighting alongside the Taliban. At times it's quite hard to distinguish between them and the Taliban. We've seen Amin al-Haq sort of appear very brazenly in Nangarhar. I don't think there's any doubt that al-Qaeda is in a very, very strong position in Afghanistan now. I think the fact that we have Siraj Haqqani in the position that he now occupies in Kabul, given his extremely close association with al-Qaeda and a whole range of terrorist groups. I think I would, without taking any pleasure in it, I would say that we called it right when we said that this was not a good prognosis for counterterrorism in Afghanistan. And then, sorry, I shouldn't go on at length, but just quickly, ISIL Khorasan, ISIL-K as we call it for short. ISIL-K is still there in Afghanistan, as we know, still mounting and or claiming attacks. It is a strategic rival of the Taliban. But there is, we mustn't be simplistic about the lay of the land in Afghanistan. It's very complicated. The Taliban itself is a complex organization. I mean, we already talked about the Haqqani network, which represents a whole dimension of complexity that people do not entirely recognize in much public commentary. And when you have a sort of a multi-sided and complex conflict of the kind that we have seen in Afghanistan, and which probably still exists to some degree in Afghanistan, then we must acknowledge that we will not be able to draw clear lines between good guys and bad guys in this current laydown in Kabul and in Afghanistan. And we should not imagine that we have dependable allies who will be our proxies in suppressing the threat from ISIL-K.
Thank you so much, Edmund. And Mike, I saw you responding visually to some of Edmund's comments, particularly about Siraj Haqqani, who I might note, just while we've been speaking, the Taliban just released photographs of the first meeting of their sort of interior ministry. And although, of course, he is now the interior minister of Afghanistan, Siraj is concealing his face. The Taliban have still not shown his face in any of these photographs. So I think that speaks volumes about that whole situation. But perhaps I might just ask you, looking back over the last 20 years and all of your work and activity in South Asia, I mean, the Haqqanis presumably played a fairly significant role in terms of a source of concern. We've heard from President Biden at times that al-Qaeda has gone from Afghanistan, but I think we've heard from Edmund that isn't an accurate statement. But we've also heard the State Department try to explain that the Haqqani network isn't the Taliban. They are different entities, as Ned Price, the spokesman, has said. I wonder if you could just expand a little bit more on the Haqqani network, Siraj himself. Why should Americans and the world at large be concerned about someone like him holding this position? And what do you think that all means for Afghanistan, but also for the counterterrorism going forward in that region?
Thank you. A question that's been on my mind for a long time, and particularly more so in the last couple of months. First of all, I want to pay a compliment to Edmund and all of his colleagues that have been putting out some of the finest analysis and reporting about trends in South Asia that I've ever seen. At the risk of offending some of my former intelligence community and military colleagues, I think that one of the many values that UN reporting has been giving us for quite some time now about these trends is they're not biased by their own work, frankly. In my opinion, too much of US government internal reporting about the realities of South Asia and the trends therein, and therefore what would happen as we move towards a peace deal and everything that would theoretically follow after that, was too often colored by the fact we had skin in the game. And it hampered our ability to be objective. And so one of the great values I always derived, particularly in my last job at NCTC, was relying on independent reporting by bodies like the United Nations. I know it's not fashionable for some Americans to think that UN reporting might be better than our own, but frankly it was. And I wish we'd adhered to it more strongly. Now, Haqqanis, you already know this, Charles, but for the broader audience, I personally think that when future historians write about what has happened over the last 20 years, I think they will write with some astonishment about how poorly the United States and the coalition understood, appreciated, and therefore were able to deal with the enormous influence, reach, and power of the Haqqani family and network. At the risk of using a bad movie analogy, I think that a good analog to what the Haqqani network has been in South Asia for many years is to watch the very first Godfather movie, or the book that the movie's based on. The Corleone family, led by Don Corleone, was widely perceived among the criminal families of New York in that story as being one of the smallest and weakest elements of the criminal enterprise there, when in fact, it was the strongest, most strategically thoughtful, and had the strongest network of relationships than any of those other criminal families, and therefore it was the strongest and most important. I personally believe the Haqqani network has been for some time the single most strategically successful, powerfully networked, and most influential extremist element in the entire region. The Haqqani network today enjoys extra-regional relationships well outside of South Asia into the Middle East and elsewhere in Asia. Almost all with like-minded, if not identical, extremist elements, groups, and networks. But inside the region, the Haqqani network is probably best known by Americans, and not incorrectly, as the hidden hand or not so hidden hand behind what we used to call HPAs, high-profile attacks in Kabul, which were incredibly dangerous. And we certainly had to deal with them. The special operations community I came from spent an enormous amount of time trying to thwart high-profile attacks in Afghanistan. But in hindsight, I now realize that one of the great virtues of them engaging in high-profile attacks is we became fixated on them. And it had for them the welcome effect of reducing the likelihood we would examine all the other things the Haqqanis engage in, which has been to establish this now global, really impressive, very energetic, and very successful terrorist network that the Haqqani family is at the center of. In my humble opinion, having Siraj Haqqani as the interior minister of the new Taliban state gives them an even larger field of opportunity to expand the reach, power, and influence of the Haqqani network. I know that's very uplifting, but that's my view.
Mike, thank you. That was the answer I was hoping for / expecting. So thank you. I wonder if I could sort of give the three of you a kind of stream of my thoughts and get you to respond. There'll be some questions thrown in there, but there's several things interlinked. So one big theme that has been debated and hashed out throughout the counterterrorism community, both government and non-government, over the last several years has been, you know, whether or not terrorist organizations or individual affiliates are still focused on the quote unquote far enemy, or whether or not they have either been forced to, or they have chosen to adapt to a more locally oriented effort. You know, notwithstanding where any of you stand on that debate, I think it's probably unarguably the case that many terrorist organizations around the world are currently locally oriented in their efforts. At the same time, I think I implied in my opening remarks that at home in the United States, and equally if I put my sort of British hat on, in Europe too, governments are fatigued by the last 20 years of effort, and for right or for wrong, are seemingly determined to pivot away from counterterrorism, certainly to relegate it in importance. So putting together that local versus global question with the policy reality at home, which is whether they're local or global, we don't think we should be focusing as much on them as we have done in the past. What are all of your opinions on those two things and how you place them together? And sort of to make it even more complicated, I'll tack on one more thing, which places it right in today's context. The Biden administration has said, you know, the future of counterterrorism is over the horizon. They haven't said it, but I assume it also means by, with, and through, which we've seen in places like Syria. Do you think that is the solution to squaring the circle that I just laid out? And if not, why? And if it is, then explain how that is the best path forward. So sorry I threw so much at you, but I think to me that seems to sort of summarize the big picture debate that is currently in front of us. So why don't we start with the same order that we started the event with? So we'll kick off with you, Trisha, if that's okay.
I was hoping you were going to start somewhere else. No, there is a lot there to unpack, undoubtedly. And I think when it comes to the desire to shift away from counterterrorism and shift towards the great power competition, one of the things that is embedded in that is going to be a challenge is that the counterterrorism threat disadvantages the United States in some of those competitions. Our diplomatic presence, our diplomatic posture, our ability to get out and engage and to effectively compete with Russia and China in places like ranging from Afghanistan to Africa to other places is hampered by the counterterrorism threat. So either we're going to overseas have to have a more risk acceptant posture in our presence, or we're going to be disadvantaged in our ability to compete. And there are some of the same pitfalls in the great power competition as we experienced in counterterrorism, which is in competing for some of these governments, we are competing for governments that lack legitimacy in important ways, that are corrupt. I think corruption the issue of corruption has now become very tightly come into focus after what we saw in Afghanistan. And so there are going to be some of those same pitfalls if we are competing with Russia and China for the favor of some of those countries that will actually exacerbate the jihadist threat as well. So I see some problems and tensions that even come with the desire to shift away from counterterrorism in terms of our ability to do the near peer competition that we want to do so much. So I'm a bit on the pessimistic side, though I don't disagree or object to the need to compete more effectively with China and Russia, and that counterterrorism should actually not be the priority over those larger strategic threats. I think we have to be savvy in how we manage those two threats and those two priorities. And I fear that we have a tendency to swing pendulums rather than to sort of integrate and effectively manage those tensions and competitions between those two different priorities.
Got it. Thank you so much, Tricia. Edmund, you're up next.
Thanks, Charles. Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing I would want to say on this is that we must never imagine that the situation is steady state. There's going to be a dynamic operating here, and that includes in this issue of the degree to which terrorism has become focused on the local. There are all sorts of reasons why it has happened. I agree with the fundamental premise that you set out. I think that's where we are right now, in the sense that al-Qaeda for a long time has been embedded in local conflicts around the world. You see them, being particularly effective actually in some of these local conflicts. And the progress of the JNIM coalition in the Sahel is really interesting and disturbing. You look at the effectiveness of al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab does, it carries out international attacks, particularly in neighboring countries like Kenya, but it's got a pretty strong local and regional agenda rather than perhaps a sort of an overbearing global agenda. In the case of ISIL, they've been forced to give up their directed international capability to mount sophisticated overseas attacks. And they actually specifically for survival purposes in Syria and Iraq 2017 to 2019 concluded that capability was a luxury that they couldn't afford. They had to sort of really tuck down to their essentials just to survive the counterterrorism onslaught, which put them in a situation where they became completely dependent upon inspired attacks to keep the sort of the dream of the so-called caliphate alive. Meanwhile, they delegated authority to the remote provinces, and you see the emergence again of more of this sort of local activity. Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, an example of where they've been particularly effective locally. And also in the Lake Chad Basin in northeastern Nigeria and spilling over the borders into the various neighboring countries. So yeah, there's lots going on locally, and what we've tended to do in the monitoring team recently in our reports to emphasize the rather different perspective of counterterrorism if you are dealing with non-conflict zones. And by that, I don't just mean North America or parts of Western Europe. I mean all non-conflict zones. This is equally true of Singapore or Hong Kong or anywhere around the world that is broadly peaceful. And then the situation in conflict zones where the threat is now particularly high, and so we have a higher level of violence, as I think we said in some of the introductory remarks, than we had 20 years ago. Whereas the threat in non-conflict zones is much lower than it used to be. The concern that I have is that this is a dynamic situation, and what happens in the conflict zone will not stay in the conflict zone. And if we forget what we had to do to suppress the threat, as it's experienced, for example, by the United States at the moment, where it feels very low, then we will, sooner or later, it will come back to us, as I think that point has been already made very well by Tricia and Mike. So if we abandon that forward defense and imagine that some sort of isolationism will work, if we turn our back on terrorism, as Mike said, we are definitely courting a problem. My worry here is that we have something of a perfect storm potentially, because all of the underlying factors that led to the rise of al-Qaeda and then the rise of ISIL, they're all still present. The conflicts, the marginalization, just some of the basic issues of need and poverty, things that can fuel extremism or drive people to take extreme measures. They're all present still. And with COVID-19, we have a situation where the capacity of member states and the amount of bandwidth that the international community has for cooperation may be sapped by the sort of the sense of having to respond to something bigger, more pressing, and something that also has significant economic impacts. If you imagine all of that coming together, and then with what has just happened in Afghanistan and a huge sort of shot in the arm for extremist inspiration, and a sort of a belief in the ability to defeat the West and defeat the Western way of life, we run the risk of lowering our defenses just as the assault is ramping up. So I think it's a dangerous situation.
Edmund, thank you so much. I don't think I could have put it much better. So thank you for that too. And Mike, your thoughts?
I cannot improve on anything my colleagues have said, but I can't resist just rapidly ticking through the topics that you raised. On the topic of, I still hear today some of my former colleagues in government talk about how the imperative is to shift away from counterterrorism because we have more important things to do when it comes to near-peer adversaries. And frankly, what it reminds me of, I have 5 children. It reminds me of moments when I would hear one of my children say at the dinner table, I really don't want to eat this broccoli. And then I would say, okay, I know you don't like it, but it's good for you. You'll be glad if you ate it, so eat it. But it's okay for a child to say that because that's what it means to be a child. You get to be childish. Frankly, and I'm really not trying to insult any of my former colleagues here, but whenever I hear this riff about, we've decided to do less about terrorism because there's more important things to do, to me that's just childish. It's certainly not strategic, because history is replete with examples of we decide to do less about terrorism, and then terrorists demonstrate to us they will not be ignored, and then we have to completely reverse course and go do counterterrorism again. Why do that to ourselves? It's an utterly predictable pattern of behavior that we really should break ourselves out of, because it's counterproductive. Terrorists will not let us ignore them. And this is compounded by the fact that terrorists everywhere are becoming more powerful. Why? Because the barriers to entry to high technology that can be weaponized for terrorist use, those barriers are falling everywhere. I mean, for goodness sakes, we've seen the Taliban in the last few years start using drone technology. The terrorists now have access to artificial intelligence, robotics, secure communications, deep and dark web technology. Why? Because they have money. That's why. I can have access to those things. You can have access to those things. Anyone with a credit card or a bank account or cryptocurrency can have access to these things. So as these weaponizable technologies become more and more available for extremist groups around the world, inevitably, they will be seen by nation state actors and other actors as useful proxies. I mean, proxy warfare is one of the oldest phenomenon of mankind because it's always convenient to have somebody else do your bleeding and your dying for you. And as terrorists everywhere become more capable, it is inevitable we're going to see this. I mean, we're already seeing it. Hezbollah, the Houthis, Russian ethnic separatists in the Ukraine and elsewhere. You can call them terrorists because they're using violence to accomplish a political goal, but they're also a useful instrument for the nation states that support them. And I think that trend is only going to grow with time. On over-the-horizon counterterrorism, I've done over-the-horizon counterterrorism. Almost everybody in the special operations world has done a fair amount of that in the last 20 years. We're really good at it. And you can do it, and you can do it successfully. But here's what you can't do. You can't have a lot of intelligence to strongly elevate your confidence that it's going to work. Why? Because you don't have anybody there. You have to do all your intelligence gathering, all your analysis from a distance, and that injects enormous risk into the operation. You can still pull it off, but you got a much higher risk of failure because of intelligence gaps. Secondly, you can't achieve tempo. Over the horizon counterterrorism is so hard to pull together because of the distances involved and because of the complexity. You do it once, if you got to do it again, maybe next month, I'll have reconstituted enough to do it again. That's not enough just to suppress a terrorist threat, let alone destroy it. The only way you can achieve high tempo counterterrorism operations is to be in proximity of the target. And finally, you're accepting a lot of risk. You're accepting much higher risk of civilian/collateral damage. Why? Because of the intelligence gaps you invite, because you're having to do your intelligence gathering at such a distance. So over the horizon counterterrorism is a thing. You can do it successfully. What you can't do is accomplish strategic effects with over the horizon counterterrorism. And that's the distinction that I see being lost in public commentary about this. Yes, you can do it, but it's not going to accomplish your strategic goals because it's too limited and it's too filled with risk. Finally, your first question about how are terrorists going to potentially change their view of near and far enemy. I think what I'm about to say has actually been happening for a while. As the world has increasingly collapsed because of the emergence of the digital age, where we can do things like this, it doesn't matter where the four of us are physically. We can have this relationship over a protracted period of time, anytime we want to, anywhere we need to, whenever by this means. So distances are collapsing everywhere. The same is true of terrorist organizations and terrorist movements. I think the distinction, their old distinction between near and far enemy is going away because they don't have to care about geographic distance the way they once did, which is why, by the way, I personally believe inspired attacks have been so strategically effective, because you can simply inspire someone literally on the other end of the world to get a rental truck and mow a bunch of people down, have instantaneous strategic effects that benefit you, regardless of how far away it was.
Mike, thank you so much. So just so the audience knows, I'm starting to fold in some of their questions into the discussion. And in doing so, I have another kind of somewhat broad-based question to pose to all of you. So you can choose how you respond, how you like, but it kind of ties in two questions that have come through, but it also relates to things that all three of you have raised already. In a sense, we've got one question, which is, introducing the importance of humanitarianism or humanitarian work. And I guess you can expand that to use all the buzzwords we know very well: stabilization, rebuilding, capacity building, et cetera, et cetera. Clearly, I think, judging from all of your comments, we haven't done either nearly enough of it or we haven't done it well enough to play a role in counterterrorism, because clearly it needs to play a role. So if you could perhaps, expand a little bit more perhaps on why that hasn't worked in the past, or why we haven't done enough, and what needs to change. And to tie into that, just perhaps to sort of re-raise something that I think, Mike, you introduced in your earlier comments, which was you made a statement about how civilian capacities have rarely matched our rhetoric. I think it was you who raised that. So I think all of us undoubtedly agree with that. But what's missing? Like, why hasn't it matched? Is it a choice? Have we chosen not to allow it to match the rhetoric, or are we not good enough at it? Does it need to be a multilateral effort rather than a unilateral effort? I guess I'm trying to throw those two things together into a broader question that doesn't limit counterterrorism just to being a kind of military law enforcement discussion. It's clearly broader than that. So if all of you can perhaps expand a little bit on that, and why don't I'll shake up the order this time. I'll allow Edmund to, or I'll ask Edmund to go first, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, they're great questions, and I think that perhaps it is a good one for me to go first on because of the UN dimension. The UN obviously has a big role in humanitarian efforts, stabilization work, and the UN also is very very firm on embedding civil society and development issues in the sort of broader counterterrorism conversation. Yeah, so I take humanitarian and stabilization slightly separately from one another. I mean, the key point I want to make about humanitarian work is, of course, it's an imperative regardless of the circumstances. It's one of the things that's already coming up as an issue over Afghanistan. We support sanctions regimes on ISIL and al-Qaeda and named Taliban individuals. We're going to be in a situation where we have named Taliban individuals who are sanctioned, who may be in situations of authority in Afghanistan, may have influence over the international community's interaction, including humanitarian assistance. So this is tricky, but one of the things that we're very clear about is that humanitarian work is a priority and must not be prevented or disabled by sanctions. So, and I guess one side of this also is it contributes to, I think, one of the things will be interesting to see is the extent to which, as Afghanistan evolves over time, the recognition within the country of the help that is received for humanitarian reasons, I think, may come to contrast with the more cynical and brutal approach of the Taliban, and that's an important part of ultimately incubating people's belief that there is a better future and a better way that will come around eventually. On stabilization, I just want to, I think one of the interesting points here, and I think this is one of the reasons why it's really important that we don't forget forward defense, that we don't say, oh, well, that's over there and it's not going to come back and threaten us. But actually, one of the biggest risks is if you have a failure of stabilization, is that you create an arena in which terrorists can bed down and get comfortable, and with resources and with time and a certain amount of impunity, because there isn't a rule of law there that they have to worry about. That's when the threat will start being projected overseas again. So, this is why I say that the situation is dynamic, and ultimately what goes on in the conflict zone will not stay in the conflict zone. It will come back to affect us in non-conflict zones. And I mean, in that respect, just moving momentarily away from Afghanistan, I mean, let's just briefly mention Syria, because this is a huge worry. I mean, not many people have said very much about Syria recently, because we were very preoccupied with Africa earlier this year. Now for a while we've been very preoccupied with what's going on in Afghanistan. There are still an awful lot of terrorists in Syria, in various parts of Syria, and there are ISIL affiliated terrorists there, and there are al-Qaeda affiliated terrorists there. Sometimes you ask yourself, well, why? Why are they still there? Because it's a difficult place. It's a hard place to survive. But the fact is, they recognise that there is no early prospect of stabilization there. And that's why they anticipate that this is going to remain fertile soil for them in the future. So I think that's, that absolutely we have to deal with these big stabilization challenges, because if we don't, then we are just going to be incubating ungoverned space from which terrorists ultimately will be able to consolidate and then mount a new and more expansive threat. And then, yeah, just the very last thing on what you were saying about civilian capacities, civic society. Just a plug for the UN. The UN does a lot of the kind of multilateral international work of the kind that you're referring to. And one of the things that I think, having been a practitioner of CT earlier in my career, one of the things that really encourages me about some of the work the UN is doing is that these issues of the involvement of civil society and awareness of the underlying causes of violent extremism and awareness of the development factors, all of this stuff is absolutely hardwired into the work that the UN does. And certainly I can remember working with foreign partners and worrying about issues like legal compliance. And this is comes back to the whole sort of 20 years of 9/11. What have we learned in these 20 years? One of the things that we've learned is that you need compliant CT partners in order to be effective in counterterrorism, because otherwise you very quickly run into difficulties over your ability to work with people in a way that is either ethically or legally sustainable. And I think that the UN is getting really good at this, and it's starting to build counterterrorism capability in member states in which we can have confidence and with which we'll be able to work.
Edmund, thank you so much. Why don't we go over to Mark?
Thank you. I can't resist making a brief comment about Edmund's mention of Syria. I think someday in the future, someone like you, Charles, will be hosting something like this with three people like us, and the topic of the conversation will be something like, why did the world not do something about the witch's brew, the witch's cauldron that has been gathering in Syria now for several years, that has now exploded in our face somewhere in the world? I hope to be wrong about that, but I doubt I will be. But back to the questions that you posed. I'll start first on the civilian capacity, or rather my critique that we've never matched our actions with our rhetoric, that we would say military action only buys time and space for more civilian expertise and capacity to solve the underpinning drivers, causes, roots, whatever you want, whatever term you prefer to use, that lead to the creation of terrorism. I think that's undeniable. I used to have to do an analysis, for example, when I was at NCTC. I was responsible for doing a yearly analysis of how does the US government spend money on counterterrorism. And I doubt anyone in this audience would be surprised that about 99% of every dollar we spend on counterterrorism goes to support people like I once was, who hunted down terrorists. And am I glad I got those resources? Of course I am. Am I glad we were able to either kill or capture as many terrorists as we did? Of course I am. But what was always dismaying was the tiny fraction of that budgetary endowment that we provide to every agency and every civil society actor and every humanitarian organization on the planet that we want to succeed so that they can actually accomplish their own missions. It's basically budget dust that we provide for everything that has to do with non-kinetic counterterrorism. So, some of the most heroic and skilled people I've ever met have been USAID developers, State Department Foreign Service officers, non-governmental organization actors of a bewildering variety, who have gone to these incredibly dangerous places like Afghanistan and tried to do the necessary civilian work that actually gets to the roots of the disease, as opposed to someone like me that attacked the symptoms of the disease. But they all suffer from the same problem. They don't have enough people, they don't have enough money, they don't have enough policy support. And so there are very, very strong limitations to what they can actually accomplish. And nowhere that I've ever been in the last 20 years where their resource levels consistent with the goals they knew they had to achieve. They were always under-resourced, always underappreciated. And frankly, for an American, if you ever want to put yourself through a bit of agony, watch some of the public testimony that goes on for appropriations for the State Department, for USAID, for other non-military organizations that are making an appeal to our Congress for funds so they can do more of the civilian work that we claim is necessary. And then compare it to what happens in military testimony. The military actor will be lavished with praise and given everything he's asked for. The civilian actor will be heaped with scorn and will not get anything he asked for. That's the way this works, unfortunately. And that, I realize I may probably sound hyperbolic here, but I've been watching this track record, this very unfortunate track record for years now, and we seem to not be able to break out of it. But if we never break out of it, we're never going to solve this problem. Finally, very quickly, on the importance of humanitarian or stabilization work. I think the single most important benefit we get from engaging in that kind of work is we create a reputation for generosity. We didn't just come to whatever country it is for our own interests. We came in defense of them as well, the local population. And we are going to stay long enough, and we are going to exert ourselves strongly enough to demonstrate we actually care about what happens to you after we're gone. But if we never solve the funding problem, we'll never get there.
Mike, thank you. Tricia?
I am thrilled to hear someone coming out of DoD make the case that I would have made as someone coming out of state. I couldn't agree more with what Mike just articulated about how the US system works. And I think the additional component to that I would add is in that 99% that DoD was being given or has been given, we frame this as a war from the outset. So it made DoD the default of who would be financed. And then we asked DoD to start doing USAID and State Department functions. And that's not what DoD is designed to do, but they were the ones getting the resources. So they were the ones then taking on parts of those missions. And so there was sort of a perpetuating cycle there, I think, that really hindered building the civilian capacity piece of it. I remember during the Obama surge, we talk about clearing areas of Afghanistan and then delivering government in a box. That was actually a term we used, which is such a vast oversimplification of what it means to build government and governance and civilian capacity in those places. But that's one of those tidbits that really reflects how underappreciated that part of the mission was at the time. So, and I do also am sort of remiss to mention that in some of the discussions that I've been involved in the humanitarian space, there's been sort of this tension too, though, about humanitarian assistance being part of counterterrorism and how we think about it and countering violent extremism. That was a source of a lot of debate and discomfort within the civil society, humanitarian organizations, USAID, and some of these conversations. And so there are some difficulties, I think, in sort of fully integrating those two missions. But I do think that there is the dramatic imbalance in the system towards DoD and towards things in DoD you can measure. How many people have been killed, how many missions you've launched. The civilian side is not as neatly packaged in terms of progress that you've made.
Great points, Tricia. Thank you so much. I think we got a lot out of just that last round. Speaking of rounds, we've got about 12 minutes left. So I'll try and do a kind of quick fire and get a few other questions individually to you now. I'll start with Edmund. One issue we haven't really necessarily talked about in the context of Afghanistan, and yes, we're kind of coming back to Afghanistan, but it's hard not to given what's happening there now, is foreign fighters. So there's been a lot of speculation in the last few weeks about whether or not and to what extent Afghanistan could become a new destination for foreign fighters. And given all of your reporting from your UN team about AQ and ISIS's activities there, I wonder if I could just ask you perhaps to expand, estimate what you think the answer to this question is as to whether or not we're likely to see that. I would add, just from my own perspective, I've heard from a couple Southeast Asian government officials in the last 10 days or so. One of them told me 100% of the chatter they were intercepting from known jihadist networks in their immediate region 100% was focused on how do we get to Afghanistan to establish an Islamic State. And almost all of that was focused and oriented around ISIS, not around AQ or the Taliban. That could be different elsewhere. There's been discussion around a border crossing with Tajikistan, which is apparently conducted by Uzbek jihadists associated with al-Qaeda. That's seen as the new entry point. But from a UN perspective and from your personal expertise, is Afghanistan a new base for foreign fighter flows, or is this a bit of an exaggeration?
Well, first of all, I'm very glad that this question came up because, of course, foreign terrorist fighters is something that we must never forget as being a huge multiplier in terms of the future international terrorist threat. It's one of the things, again, we're happy to sort of put Syria and Iraq behind us, but have we really put them behind us? When you had more than 40,000 people who joined that particular cause, and the majority of those people still alive, even if you had a relatively small ratio of people who are still an active threat, that's still an awful lot of people. And there are other complexities that, of course, including people who are still stranded in northeastern Syria. So this is a really big issue. And I usually frame it in terms of thinking 20 years ahead, perhaps, or 10 to 20 years ahead. One of our weaknesses, I think, as officials, and it's true of politicians as well, is you tend to be working on a relatively short cycle. You're saying, is there going to be a problem in the next 3 years or the next 5 years? But actually, this is a huge multiplier that will be with us, 20 years from now, just as we're still worrying about people who were, Saif al-Adil being a good example of somebody who's a problem now. And you go back to his history in the 90s and the early 2000s. On your specific point about Afghanistan, it's early to say. I mean, there's no doubt that the chatter is about this. There's no doubt that the inspiration is there. People saying, this is where it's happened. This is where the US has been defeated, and the West has been defeated, and NATO has been defeated. And so there is definitely a very strong sort of sense of enthusiasm out there for Afghanistan. We were monitoring this systematically over the last few years, and of course the main driver to monitor it was the question of what happened after the defeat of ISIL in Iraq and Syria. What would be the extent of the relocator issue? We called them relocators, people who went from one conflict zone to another. And interestingly, at least up until the last time that we looked at this, there were still more Afghan veterans in Syria than there were Syria or Iraq veterans in Afghanistan. In other words, the relocation effect, although it's real, it's probably slower than people thought it would be. People used to imagine that there was you hit a button, a sort of scatter button, and everyone left Iraq and Syria, and they all turned up in Afghanistan, or they turned up in the Sahel, or they turned up in Marawi in the southern Philippines, or something of that sort. And in fact, it's much slower burn than that. But that I think is the trend. I think Afghanistan is now a pole of attraction. I think at the moment, Iraq and Syria are not a pole of attraction. They're not drawing people in. And I think Afghanistan will. How fast that happens is another matter. And of course, another interesting question with the attraction of foreign terrorist fighters is, where do you attract them from? There are a lot of small conflicts which tend to attract foreign terrorist fighters from within the immediate region. And for a while, that probably was true of Afghanistan. But sometimes that then expands to a more global pole of attraction, that you're actually bringing in people, some angry young man in Derby in England says, I've got to get to Afghanistan. This is where it's happening. And I fear that there is some sign of that, but how quickly it will happen operationally, it's hard to say.
Edmund, thank you so much. Tricia, a question for you. You mentioned in your, I think, initial comments that you were saying, al-Qaeda has kind of in defense of al-Qaeda, it has been very adaptable and more adaptable than perhaps we give it credit for. And I think you said it was likely to evolve again. I wonder if I could, in lieu of a couple of questions I've also received, kind of ask you about, what do you mean by that? How is it likely to, how do you think it is likely to adapt, in what way? And perhaps to tack onto that, some earlier comments we'd had earlier in the discussion about a succession. You know, the Saif al-Adl issue being in Iran, you know, is that likely coming succession part of that adaptation, or is it more likely to be a hindrance or an obstacle to it?
On the evolution point, I think that unfortunately, al-Qaeda will have some options about how to evolve because there's nothing that allows evolution like a safe haven. The ability to train, to coordinate, to manage, to command and control, that creates a lot of opportunities. Where there's adaptation that comes out of pressure. There's adaptation that comes out of duress, right? And we've seen al-Qaeda, the franchise approach was something of an adaptation to manage pressure and maintain its vanguard status and be viable in the counterterrorism environment. It will now have a much more open environment in which to undertake its adaptations. And so I think that how it will evolve is something of an interesting question and relates back to some of what you just talked about in terms of what Edmund was talking about who comes to Afghanistan. Will there be another generation that's attracted there that al-Qaeda can incorporate? And there's also a generation of al-Qaeda now that is less well known to us as Saif al-Adl and Zawahiri and sort of those al-Qaeda names that grew up in the Afghanistan conflict and have now been empowered by it. And there have been multiple occasions in my career where the person who succeeds the leader is not really someone that's that well known to us, maybe not even known at all to us. They're sort of a dark horse that is known enough internally, respected enough internally, but isn't a name that the West really knows. And that's not necessarily an hindrance in terms of the organization's ability to adapt and evolve. So we can be a little bit biased in favor of the known names to us. And that isn't, you know, in the case of Zawahiri, that was an obvious succession. But in a lot of other cases, people have seemed to have, from our standpoint, almost come out of nowhere and still been pretty effective leaders and even very galvanizing and inspiring leaders. So I think succession will be part of that. I think we may find out tomorrow what is happening in terms of al-Qaeda's leadership situation. If we don't get something from Zawahiri on the 20th anniversary, I think that raises very real questions about what his status is. But I don't see Saif al-Adl as necessarily being a revolutionary leader within al-Qaeda. He may be more like a Zawahiri as a caretaker of what bin Laden built. But I do think that in succession, there is the possibility for a leader who really does act as sort of a visionary who really evolves the group in new directions. And I think we just have to constantly be looking for those indicators of how it will evolve that are not yet clear, but to stop looking back quite as far to al-Qaeda as what it was in 2001 no longer exists. Ergo, the organization is so defeated and can't rejuvenate in some kind of way.
Great, thank you so much, Trisha. And Mike, last question for you, kind of an analytical one. Over the last 20 years, I think we've certainly seen that the sort of dominant path of adaptation, evolution, could best be termed, as it has in one of our questions, by the affiliate model. So we saw al-Qaeda, affiliate by expanding and proliferating, and we've since seen ISIS do the same thing. The question really is, especially given what you've talked about earlier about the kind of globalization of terrorism, the proliferation of technology, finance, and what have you, with that and the affiliate model being true, is this a source of, or is this illustrative of a terrorist organization's strength, or is this the response to very strong Western counterterrorism pressure? There was a very interesting article written yesterday by Hassan, if anyone hasn't read it, which kind of makes the argument that one of the successes of American counterterrorism is that al-Qaeda first affiliated and then decentralized. And I guess to me, that seems like an open debate. So it is almost following on from Trisha's comments about adaptation. Is this an adaptation by choice and something that we should be worried about, or is it a sign of vulnerability?
I think there is a good argument that can be made. I would certainly make the argument that effective, mostly kinetic counterterrorism pressure over many years has compelled organizations like al-Qaeda to do things they might not otherwise have wanted to do. And in some ways, in some areas, have made them less effective. And that's all to the good. I'm glad we've done those things, and I'm glad it had those effects. But I think the larger question, or the larger reality rather, is that the field of opportunity for violent extremist movements of all kinds, not just al-Qaeda, to expand their reach, power, and influence, much in the way I was talking about the Haqqani network earlier, have become almost limitless. And it's primarily because of the emergence of the digital age. As I was listening to your question, I was thinking about a potentially useful analogy is to consider how the human race went from things like AT&T to Google. You know, you compare the power and reach and knowledge of Google with AT&T, and AT&T was a formidable thing for those of us old enough to remember that ancient animal. But Google is exponentially more powerful and capable than AT&T could ever have dreamed of being. Why? Because of the availability of modern technology, which, as I mentioned earlier, is now available to everyone. The liberalization of digital technology has been an enormous benefit for mankind. It's also an enormous benefit to that portion of mankind that are terrorists. And they are rapidly exploiting that opportunity. They will continue to exploit that opportunity. So I personally think the danger and complexity of terrorism is only going to get worse, because we're not really addressing I don't know of any country on earth that is effectively addressing the rapidly expanding availability of weaponizable technology that can be easily procured by any terrorist that has access to some cash or cryptocurrency.
Okay, on that positive note, I'm going to have to close things out. We're just running out of time. But first off, Mike, Edmund, and Tricia, thank you so much for joining us. There's been a really fascinating conversation. I certainly could have carried on for much longer, but thank you for taking the time to join us, and especially, as I say, on this somber occasion, marking the anniversary, which is coming tomorrow. And thank you also to the Middle East Institute's audience for joining us today. Thank you for your questions. I did my best to tie as many of them into the conversation, but I look forward to continuing to engage with all of you in the coming weeks and months, as this issue, as we've heard, is certainly not going away anytime soon. So for now, thank you very much.